Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for coming. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Laura Figueroa. I'm an assistant professor in the Environmental Conservation Department at UMass Amherst, and I'm so excited that you're here. So when Rachel reached out and asked, she basically asked to share a little bit about the work that we do in the lab. And so I'll start by introducing myself. I would broadly introduce myself as an entomologist. I work primarily on bees, and as an ecologist, I think about these diverse systems of interplay between insects and plants primarily. And when I tell people that I'm an entomologist, often some of the things that come to mind are the disease vectors, right? The mosquitoes, or like Anopheles gambiae mosquito, that vectors malaria and all of the death that is associated with that. Or some other times when insects are come to mind, it's those agricultural pests that are problematic in the field that can impact stored grain and that are really, with climate change, potentially going to be exacerbated, these negative impacts. I live in the Northeast of the US, where we have a lot of issues also with insects, non-native insects that are really damaging our forests and are really wreaking havoc in a lot of different species and have been doing so for many years. So often when I say an entomologist, these are the things that first come to mind. But then, of course, because you're here, you know that there is such a broader impact of insects. Just like they're a problem, they're also the solution to a lot of elements. So they can serve as biological control agents, either as predators or parasitoids. They're very important in terms of nutrient cycling and as a food source. More than 500 million tons of prey of insects are consumed by insectivorous birds every year. And you can see that they're a source of food for invertebrates and vertebrates alike, including these vertebrates, humans. There's over 2,000 species of insects that are eaten by people all over the world and have been the case for millennia. And and it is currently an active area of how we can continue to make our diets more sustainable. Insects have also been really important for culture, right? So it's not just ecologically, which, as I've mentioned, it's paramount, but also in our sense of place, from ancient Egypt to the way we make art to the tools that we use in everyday places. For example, even from the way we've used like different materials. It's so important. And last but not least, one of the areas that I've been working on for over a decade now is insects as pollinators. Of course, you have bees, you have butterflies, you have syrphid flies, wasps, beetles. Many different groups of insects are essential for pollination. And the way that we can think about that is you can have different crops that are vary in how much they depend on pollinators for. And so here, this is seminal work by Klein et al., Alexander Klein, that basically classified crops into how much they depended on pollinators. So some essential, basically, if you don't have pollinators, don't produce crops, all the way to no increase. And you can see most of them depend on pollinators to some amount, and some essentially so. And so this work has been cited thousands and thousands of times. But it was limited to crops that were present in the FAO, and so it can exclude many regionally important species. It was conducted 20 years ago, in which time so much work has happened, and it doesn't actually evaluate quality metrics. And so quality metrics would say if you have a crop and then it is a higher value, so let's say it's more nutritious or it's more marketable versus just being yield. And so when I was a PhD student at Cornell with a group of other amazing researchers in the entomology department, we took it upon ourselves to really update this and have a much broader assessment. And so we decided and this was a side project for all of us, including Dr. Cass Urban Mead, who works for Xerxes and is an absolutely dear friend and amazing collaborator. So I want to give a special shout out to Cass. We decided to screen over 28,000 title and abstracts from the literature in a systematic way to get the most robust sense of what is the status of pollinator dependence in the world. We ultimately ended up extracting data from over 1,000 papers. And just for context, often many reviews will include 50 to 100. And so this is really massive in the scale and scope. And so we ended up including data from all over the world, as you can see on this figure, which is also really important because many reviews are biased. This is not to say that all regions are equally represented, but we do have broad representation from, over 1,000 studies, over 300 crops in many different countries. And so what we found was basically that there was broad impacts. And so you might not have seen this kind of graph before, and so I'm going to walk you through it. So on the x-axis, basically on the bottom, you have the pollinator contribution. If it's on the negative value, it means that pollinators reduce whatever's happening, and if it's above the zero, it means it increases it. And there's dashed line, basically means that if it's touching that, we can't actually tell if it's having a positive or negative impact. So anything that's not touching the dashed line and is on the right means that it's a positive impact of pollinators. And you can see most things are not touching the line and are on the right. And so there's a lot of different values of yield. So for example, fruit weight per area, fruit set, and a lot of quality metrics, such as germination, marketability, individual size. And so having pollinators is super, super important, both in terms of quantity, yield metrics, and quality. Basically, this marketability, size, composition, and growth. And we did this, again, as I mentioned, not just for the crops that were in the FAO, but also smaller, really regionally relevant crops that are really important for nutrition, for culture. And so we ended up doing these regional and global crops, and we found that some of those regional crops that are really important for nutrition depend on pollinators even more so than global crops. And so again, here on the top, we have the yield, on the bottom, we have the quality metrics, and the y-axis is basically just how much they depend on pollinators. And again, you can see most of them are either essential, high, or modest. And so really, really high dependence, even in this much more thorough assessment. And, given that we're talking about pollinators and insects, when we did this assessment of who actually shows up, the biggest group by far of the most represented crop visitors are Hymenopteran, which are the ants, the bees, and the wasps, most of them being actually bees, followed by flies. And flies, I think, have been historically underappreciated as pollinators, but they're increasingly being recognized. We have butterflies, we have beetles, and there's other groups that are also present, including bats. And we have even some other groups such as spiders. There's a couple of spiders that can be pollinators, but most of the spiders that are present on the flowers are actually waiting to snatch a bee or a fly when it's doing the pollination. And so again, we have this broad diversity of visitors, but most of them are insects, and most of those, in fact, are bees. And what we found is that they really have a positive impact on there's a broad diversity, and they have a high beneficial impact in crop yield. Okay, so all of that is to say, and you all have probably heard, yes, pollinators are really important, but the more we dig in, the more we see just how much we depend on pollinators at a global level. And so there's no question that we need to have effective ways of monitoring insects, both those that have potential to be have negative impacts for society, those that could outbreak in forests that could have negative impact for agriculture, but also many of those that are beneficial that could be declining. We need to have measures for how are the pollinators doing? How are the the those insects that are providing the baseline for our trophics level, those that are important for our culture, for our nutrition? And we really need to have these effective ways of monitoring them and both assessing potential decline, but also, given the work that Xerxes is doing, we need to evaluate the effectiveness of conservation measures. We don't want to just implement conservation measures and have no idea, is it working, is it not working? Because that way, that doesn't allow us to course correct and make changes to better serve the ecosystem. And so whenever we're thinking about these potential declines that have been documented for many, many groups over the last few decades, we really want to know what's causing these declines. And so whenever there are questions about the insect declines, there are often four big categories that come to mind. The biggest one being loss of habitat. And so if insects don't have access to food resources, to nesting substrates, that can be really, really detrimental. There's also big questions of pesticide pressure and exposure depending on the group and where they're present. There's elements of pathogen stress, and for some groups, pathogens that are being distributed through people and through movement of our actions. And also all of this interplay with global climate change, which can include not only increasing temperatures, but also increase in extreme changes. So heat waves, droughts, floods. So all of this is happening not in isolation because sometimes there's certain evidence that insects, if they're exposed to one stressor, but all the other ones are not happening, they can have a resiliency. It's often when there's interacting stressors that there can be a really strong negative impact. And so within this context, there's many elements of both understanding each of these, but what I want to talk to you today about is how can we actually monitor in these different conditions? And there are a lot of different ways of monitoring. But one of the ones that I want to talk about are different types of commonly used methods, and they all have strengths and limitations. So I want to start off by saying that every single method has strengths and has limitations. So one of the most common methods that has been used is the use of traps. And so, for example, pan traps or pitfall traps that where basically soapy water is placed in these colored bowls, and the bees that are flying in fall in, and then they're collected. And this is really really important for insects that can only be identified to species not on the wing. Like, so basically, if you need to look at the wing venation, or if you really need to use metabarcoding or some other element, you can't actually identify them when on the fly on the wing. And so collecting them is really important. But you can imagine that that might have some limitations. There are known taxonomic biases in terms of which groups are likely to fall into different traps. And also, it is lethal. It is a lethal type of sampling approach. And depending on the type of modeling, that's really important to know. And another part is that even though it's very straightforward in the moment to put out traps, it requires a lot of people power to collect the samples to make sure that they don't rot in, if it's dry, they don't that basically decompose, to clean them, to pin them, to label them, to store them, and to basically have the whole process to where these insects that were collected are actually contributing to science. And we're currently, as you all know, we're living in a really interesting and there's a lot going on in the world. And one of the big things that we hear about constantly is AI. And while there are a lot of ways in which AI can be deeply problematic, and there's things that we need to find out about it, it's currently here. And one of the things that we can do is, well, how can we actually use it for good given that it's here? And so many of you might actually be using AI on your phone already for ecosystem, for understanding the environment. And so some of you might actually have Merlin app on your phone. And if you don't, I encourage you to download it. It's free and it basically uses bioacoustics to tell you whenever there are birds around. And so you basically, if you hear a bird song, you can use the app, tell it, hey, what is this song? Who is this bird based on the song? And it will tell you. And so there are many potential benefits to this approach in that it is non-lethal, it can be standardized, and you can deploy these across large spatial and temporal scales. Of course, I'm talking about the benefits, but just like everything, there are limitations. You can imagine that for species that do not produce very clear acoustic signals or in really noisy environments, that this might not be appropriate. But there are also strengths, like I mentioned, trade-offs in all approaches. For this talk, I want to tell you a little bit about how bioacoustics have been used to model insects broadly, some of the work that we have been doing to understand and monitor bees through bioacoustics for the past 5 years, how we can use bioacoustics and other non-lethal machine learning approaches to monitor bees in different types of landscapes, both in the northeastern system, but also in tropical forests. And in the future, what is some of the work that we can do, especially within the context of climate change? So let's start with thinking about what has actually been done with bioacoustics for monitoring insects. Whenever I started this, I maybe thought, okay, there's some grasshoppers, right? You can think of like grasshoppers have a very clear song. And I was really interested in bees at that point, but I didn't really know what was happening. So that was really the impetus, like what's been done? What's been done so that I can contribute in the parts that haven't been done? And so this was done work with my student at the time, who was a technician, Anna Kohlberg, and a collaborator, Chris Myers, who's at Cornell, where we developed the systematic review approach, which again is developing keywords and looking in the literature and finding as many relevant texts as possible, and then extracting data from those, just as I mentioned from the previous pollination study that I mentioned earlier. So for this one, we screened over 2,000 title and abstracts, and then extracted data from 170 C studies. We basically then, from those, we separated the data into 3 different bins. And so a study was either deemed to be signal, statistics, and other, which basically just means any study where they use bioacoustics and they developed a model, but really the researcher predetermined what was the key value. So for imagine that you are a researcher who studies grasshoppers and you know that what this a given species, grasshopper X, reaches a certain frequency, and you say, okay, I'm going to train this model to where whenever this frequency is reached, that is a species of interest. So that's basically the researcher is determining what the key feature is. But again, we're now living in an area of machine learning. And that one of the things that's really interesting about that is that we do not determine, oh, it's these hertz or it's this frequency or this other component. It's more about giving enough data to train the model and having the model train itself in some ways. And one particular example of that is deep learning. So you all have probably heard about neural networks, and this is a type of machine learning algorithm that basically uses the way that people, I mean, there's some parallels to the way that people make connections in brains. And so you could imagine that if you're like one of the easiest ways that I like to think about deep learning and convolutional neural networks in particular is you can imagine if there's a small child that has just been, starting to learn language and you're trying to explain a bird, you don't describe like, oh, let me tell you, small child, about the evolutionary tree of every component. And so a bird is, and you don't describe, you might, at that very young age, you might just point to enough examples of birds, right? You might just point and point and point. And then if the little child points to an airplane and says bird, you would say, no, that's not. And so it's more, you don't, at the end of the day, it's give enough examples of, yes, these are examples of birds. And then like these are things that look like birds but are not birds. And that's actually how we train deep learning algorithms. We basically have enough training and test data to have those connections. So what did we find in terms of what was present in the insect bioacoustics literature? Well, I was actually blown away with what we found. We found models for 302 insect species from 9 orders, which again, I was thinking maybe we would find 10 or 15 species. And so I was really taken. I was blown away. We find examples. So these are the 5 most commonly encountered species. The first is a type of pest, the red palm weevil. The second one was the sounds that honeybees make in their colonies. And we'll come back to why this is important. This is not when they're flying around, but in the colony, like in the hive. We also found information of like other pests, such as the rice weevil, and then 2 species of mosquitoes that can vector diseases. What was really interesting about the honeybee colonies is, again, it wasn't when they're flying, but in the colonies, there's really interesting research of like trying to understand sounds that healthy bees make or unhealthy bees make. And there was even one study that was monitoring air quality based on the sounds that bees make, because apparently there's some colonies that can make pollutant specific noises. And so this idea is, can we actually use bees as a natural sensor for monitoring air quality? So there's a lot of diversity that we were finding. And if we had to bin it into these different categories, what we were finding is that most of them were economic pests. There were some studies on ecologically relevant taxa, such as grasshoppers and other groups, and a smaller subset of those disease vectors, all of which were mosquitoes. And so when we think about economically damaging pests, that can be both in the field, but also in stored grain. And you might be asking, like, what do you mean stored grain? You can imagine if you have a bin of stored grain and there's no pests, it should make no sounds. But if the pests are moving them, the grains itself will move. And so then you can train a model to indirectly encounter pests through those sounds that they make. We found a lot of different types of taxa from both wood and food and others that are present for the pests. As I mentioned, for all the disease vector studies, all of them were focused on mosquitoes, but a single model could differentiate up to 20 different species of mosquito, which again is also mind-boggling. When, like, if you've been woken up in the middle of the night, you might not think that different species of mosquitoes could be making different sounds, but with enough training data, that has been found. In terms of ecological studies, there are a lot of different areas of focus, the biggest one being assessment of restoration efforts. And this occurred, there was bioacoustics in soil invertebrate communities. There were some in tropical rainforest communities. There's aquaacoustics, so basically in how the soundscapes underwater are being affected, and so the effect of pond restoration. There was even assessment of community science being able to find an endangered species of cicada. And so this is one of the ways that audio it can be really powerful is that it can be easily trained for and shared with many, many different people. And then they can cover a lot of ground. And so by doing this, they were able to find an endangered species in this broader area. And one of the other parts that's really great is there has been a much broader existing framework of audio with bats, particularly, and with birds. And once those data exist, you can actually, once they exist, be like, oh, well, why don't we ask those questions about other groups? And so existing data has been used from a bat monitoring program to understand katydids. And so here, these are the different bins. And the big takeaway is you can see that there's way more studies that are being conducted now. So it's an increasing area of study. And most of the ones in recent years are either machine learning or deep learning. And this graph is basically to show you that many, many different insect groups have a lot of the different models. So it's not just like, oh, all the bees are one type of model and all of the flies are another type of model. There's really a lot of diversity. And ultimately, you can get up to really, really high accuracy in detection and classification for these different models. And it was higher for deep learning than the other groups. So we were really, really excited. And one of the things that we concluded in this one section is, okay, so what are ways that we can move forward? So one of the things I just showed you some example of like the applied restoration and conservation studies. But what we were finding is by far, most of the studies were focused on method development. And so what that means, it's people who are focusing in developing the model, but are not actually testing it. And often what can happen is if you just train your model in the lab setting, you can get something that's very different than it's in real life, all of the conditions that happen in the field. The other part was that most did not make their code fully available. And so if other people wanted to build on what they did, it would be really hard, if not impossible. And similarly, only 14% had a user interface that could facilitate use. And so basically, if you don't already program with Python for most of these papers, you would be out of luck. And yet, as we've mentioned, there's high relevance for the diseases, for the pests, for the ecologically relevant and conservation focused studies of people who might care, of practitioners who might care. Many of you might care, but if you don't happen to already have the programming expertise, you would be really excluded. And in terms of the pollinator side of things, while there were a lot of studies on honeybees, they were all on the colony. Most of them were focused on the colonies, and very few focused on bumblebees and other types of species. And so the conclusion from this first section is basically that I advocate for bioacoustics to be a part of a multifaceted toolkit. So it's not that bioacoustics is the one size fits all solution. I think that there are many other, so there are times when it's appropriate to do bolt traps. There are times when audio or video might be appropriate. There are times when visual transcepts are appropriate. There might be times when molecular methods are appropriate. It really depends on the question, but just knowing that this is a tool that is available and that can be really useful. And so, as I mentioned, this started for me from an effort of wanting to understand bioacoustics more effectively in the context of bees. And so in 2020, I had the great pleasure and privilege of working with a team from Laurel Symes, the assistant director for the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Shia Madhutsana, who at the time was our research associate there, and Chris Myers, who also works at Cornell. And so we wanted to develop these machine learning algorithms. And so as I mentioned, that deep learning is giving enough examples. And so what that can look like is we record sounds of bees in the field. The deep learning is actually based on images. And what we do is then we convert the sound into a spectrogram, into a visual representation. And then we train the neural networks based on the sound images. And then once the models are trained, we can use them to detect and classify the different categories. But one of the ways that I was so grateful for working with Laurel is she has really broad experience in the field of bioacoustics. And she shared an example of a group of researchers who were really interested in katydids and trained these models hundreds and hundreds of hours of recording, but they all did it in the lab. And again, like they were getting these like these really nice model outputs. They were really proud of what they did. And then they go to the field and nothing is working. And they eventually actually figured out that whenever they were in the lab, there's sounds all around us. Probably right now, if you were to be quiet for a second, you would hear your computer making some sounds, or maybe you have, some other the light. In this case, the refrigerator was making a lot of sound, and they didn't think about it, and so they had accidentally trained their model to figure out like not their katydid, but the sound of the refrigerator because it was always in the background. And so for that reason, we wanted to be really, really intentional. And for the past, we have 5 field seasons worth of audio data from these bees to make sure that we could have a really robust model. Because bumblebees and honeybees, for example, bumblebees in particular vary a lot in size and presentation. And so we want to make sure we could account for that variation that naturally occurs in the field. And so what that can look like is here on the left, I'm showing you honeybees in flight. In the middle, the common eastern bumblebee worker in flight. And then also bumblebees have this really interesting strategy for us removing pollen from certain types of flowers where, especially, for example, this is a tomato that requires porocidal dehiscence, where basically only the right frequency will enable the pollen to be removed. And so it sounds very different. Like if a regular a sound is just continuous, this one's much higher. And so we wanted to be able to differentiate among those. And so what we basically found was that after 1 year of sampling, these are our precision and recall curves. And so precision is basically of everything that you're saying is a bee, how many of those are actually bees. And you can imagine you can be very precise, like you call the bee, but then there's a whole bunch of bees that you're missing. And recall is the opposite, is like how many of the bees that are there are you calling? And you might catch all the bees, but then you might also call the plane a bee. You might call the human voice a bee, right? So that you can imagine that there are these constraints and trade-offs among these two. And so obviously, like in the perfect unrealistic scenario, you would have perfect precision and recall, but really there are these trade-offs. And so after the first year, we still had a lot of work to do. And as we've collected more data, now we've ended up with precision and recall curves that are really, really, really quite strong for the field, which enable us to say with high confidence that the bees that we're calling bees are bees in fact. And one of the things that, as I mentioned in the review, so many of these previously published studies don't have a user interface. And so I'm really happy that our model will be hosted on Raven Pro so that anyone who wants to can access it. And basically the idea is that you could deploy audio recorders in the field and leave them for extended periods of time. And this would be able to tell you when are the bees actually active. And so we're really, really excited about this. We're hoping to submit this within the next few months, and so that should be readily available by the fall. And so one of the ways that we're actually using to understand this is like, okay, you might have questions of like, how do you actually use this? And so one of the ways that we're doing that is in the Northeast. And so in the Northeast, there are ambitious renewable energy goals, which is wonderful. And one of the ways that that is happening is through the expansion of solar. And so there can be a lot of actual really understandable tensions in a state that is currently 60% forested and the desire to expand solar. And so we really wanted to know what the relationship was between like the landscape context and potential management of solar facilities for pollinators in particular, and whether we could integrate bioacoustics and other types of machine learning image-based monitoring in these facilities. And so for this, we wanted to know who are the pollinators in these facilities, how does the landscape affect it, how does the management, and in terms of management, we wanted to know whether they seeded with wildflowers or they didn't, and how bioacoustics and image-based monitoring could be helpful. And so for this, we had 10 different sites. And so what I'm showing you here on the x-axis are the 10 different sites. On the y-axis is you have the proportion in the landscape. And what you can see in green is we specifically selected these sites to have a broad representation of forest cover in the landscape. And these sites were in Massachusetts and in New York. And we basically, specifically my grad student, Grace Schifrin, pictured here, went to these sites over the course of 2 years and collected data using quadrats and transects where she walked these. And she really did an incredible job. Over the course of the 2 years, she did 1,600 quadrats and 800 transects at these different, spread across all 10 different sites. And here you can see one of the pictures of the audio recorder that has been deployed alongside those other types of monitoring approaches. And so what we found is while we did find many different groups, the communities were really dominated by honeybees, bumblebees, and syrphid flies. But since often we're interested in having this higher diversity, we wanted to know what explains it. And so here on the x-axis on the first graph, it's the proportion native plants. When you had a higher proportion of native plants, you ended up having a higher abundance of insects. And similarly, a higher diversity of different types of plants ended up with more insects and a greater diversity of insects. And this is important to note because some of these sites were really dominated by a few non-native groups. And so having this understanding that having more native plants is important and having a greater diversity is important. And when we put that all together, it helps us. We found basically that landscape was not a strong predictor, but the proportion of native plants was really important, and the diversity of floral richness was really important for insect abundance and richness. And so as Xerxes has done really incredible work thinking about how we plant pollinator habitat. And so that was one of the things that we were really interested in as well. And so we basically wanted to know if I'll go back to this graph where basically half of our sites, or a little like 6 of our sites had planted with wildflowers, native wildflowers, and 4 had not. That was as close as we were able to get it. And so we wanted to know, is there a relationship when you plant versus when you don't plant? And so what we actually found was that indeed planting with a native wildflower mix did increase your proportion of native plants. And again, as we just mentioned, that's associated with greater diversity. However, it's not all, there's some winners and losers, so to speak. Like there's some plants that very easily establish where they're sown, like you have 100% establishment success, and you have some that have 0% establishment success. And this is really important for managers and those who are interested to understand that we really have to be intentional about what plants we're planting. And as we're going to get into at the end of the talk, potentially where we're sourcing them to make sure that we can have the highest success possible. So while we're still processing the audio samples, I want to show you an example of the image-based sampling that we use at these facilities. And so this is with collaboration with Yuki Hamada from the Argonne National Labs. And so what that can look like is this camera system takes images of the insects and wildlife in general. So we also have images of mammals and birds at the facilities. And so this summer, we're going to be looking at the relationship between these other groups and the monitoring that we have discussed. And so while we're processing that, currently we'll have a final result soon. Okay, so all that is to say, we can use these different types of models in the Northeast to answer really pressing questions right now. Like, so there's a lot of questions of what's the best way to have win-win, can we reduce the negative impacts and try to get more towards a win-win scenario, for example, for solar. But this is in the Northeast, right? And so there are other parts of the world that have very different landscape considerations. And so I've also been working on using machine learning approaches to monitor bees in different types of changing landscapes. And so now we're going to all collectively go to Costa Rica for a second. And so it's going to be a little warm. It's going to be beautiful. There's going to be a lot of forests around us. And you can imagine that while Costa Rica has been a leader in many ways in terms of conservation success, they also have had a lot of deforestation, and they face a lot of pineapple monocultures that it's just basically, as far as you can see, it's just pineapple. And so there's a lot of questions of how can these changes in landscapes that are happening at these different scales and tropical systems, what's happening to the bee communities there. And the bee communities there are really totally different than the ones we're having here. They're dominated by a tribe called the Meliponini tribe that are the stingless bees that produce this like incredible tasting honey, and they are social. They can have thousands of workers, and yet they are ecologically very distinct from the social bees that we are used to in the US, for example. And one of the groups that I've been really working on for a number of years and just find deeply fascinating, maybe you've heard of vulture bees. So if we think of bees as vegetarian wasps, there's this group of bees in particular that there's 3 species that we know of that actually no longer gets their protein from meat, from pollen, and now actually gets it from meat. And we're finding that there's a lot of different species that have this much broader diet range. And so we're really trying to understand how the landscape and the floral resources influence these dietary choices for these species. And so I've been working with an amazing group of team, with an amazing team and group of people in Costa Rica. I want to give a special shout out for my student, um, Fer Rojas Campos, Ran, and then 2 researchers at here in the US, Quinn McFrederick at UC Riverside and James Krall at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Caro Esquivel, who is a professor at La Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. So an incredible team really trying to understand these questions in these like in the middle of the forest. And so the way that we employ these types of camera systems is we are trying to monitor using cameras to see movement, to understand behavior in different contexts. And here you can see a collaborator, James Krall, setting up a camera to start. And one of the things that's really powerful is by using automation is we can actually track movement of individuals on baits. And so, for example, we can see when they come in, when they come out, and what factors at the landscape and local scale might be influencing the use of different resources. And so this is a project that is ongoing, and hopefully we were very interested in applying for a National Science Foundation grant. So hopefully that is still going to be possible. We can all send positive energy to make that happen. We'll see. And so in terms of future directions, one of the things that I'm really excited about for moving forward is really thinking about pollinator habitat, especially in the face of global change. And so I want to highlight one grant that we have with Lynn Adler, Shalini Jha, and other amazing collaborators, and postdoc in the lab, Kate Borchardt, where we're understanding how the diversity and composition of different pollinator habitats that are established primarily in yards, in gardens, in university campuses, how we can maximize the co-benefits for pollinator health, including reducing disease pressure. In terms of climate change, doing some work with collaborators Diana Obregón and Katia Poveda in La Asociación de ABC of Costa Rica, of Colombia, where we're really trying to say, okay, given that climate change is really stressing out the smallholder meliponiculturists, what can we actually do? Are there ways that we can supplement the colonies in these moments of climate stress to both improve the well-being of the bees and actually these smallholders who really depend on it for their medicine and livelihood? And lastly, the last area of the projects that I want to highlight, one that I'm really excited about, that's like there's 2 complementary projects, one that's funded through the CASC Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a product of the USGS, which is really, really important, and right now needs all the support that it can get, and another that's supported, it's a cooperative agreement with the US Fish and Wildlife Service that's actually thinking about, okay, given how much work is being put into thinking about pollinator habitat, how can we be intentional? And so whenever in this project for that I mentioned earlier, and this was happening 2.5 years ago, I started compiling lists of pollinator friendly seed mixes from the Northeast. I was shocked by how many of them are chock full of non-native species. Some of them from California. There are even like Northeast pollinator seed mixes that have European species. And so, first of all, like that's just, that's where we're working on. And then even the ones that were focused on native species had no information on provenance, so where they're coming from. And so since the climate is warming and, we need to address that at the cause, but in the meanwhile, we still have to address the current warming that's already happening. Can we be more intentional with where we source our seeds to create more climate resilient seed plantings? And so we're doing projects where we're basically, for native plants that have broad ranges, including the South and the North, we are wild harvesting seeds from both of those conditions and either experimentally exposing them to heat wave or control conditions, or planting them in different conditions of warming or control for longer periods. And so we're really, really excited because this will be able to help us better understand how provenance could be potentially used to inform climate smart pollinator plantings. And so this was a quick overview about a lot of the work that we do in the lab. And there's a lot of other projects, but I thought it would be too much to talk about everything, but we're really in the lab, we're broadly interested in thinking about insect ecology and conservation and changing landscapes and what we can actually do about it. So how can we better understand these incredible insects? How can we understand the causes and the stressors, and what can we do to better support them? So with that, I would love to thank all of you for listening, acknowledge my team and the funding sources, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I love that we kind of got like a snippet of a few of the different projects that you're working on. It's kind of like a sample plate. I'll need to have you come back and take a deeper dive into some of these. All right. So as a reminder for folks, please put your questions in the Q&A. We have lots of good ones. So I'm going to actually start with this one. Stephanie is a grad student, also studying insects, including pollinators in solar arrays. After seeing your results about the importance of native flowers in solar, they were curious if you've noticed any fast changes in plant composition over the 2 years you surveyed. They've seen this in some of their sites where the seeded mix looked great the first year and then it quickly declined and it's taken over by invasive slash woody plants. Important for land managers to think about as well, which I agree.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie, for the question. And absolutely. I think that was one of the things that we were just so surprised by the proportion of non-native at many of these species, at many of these sites. And I think that that's one of the questions, right? Of disturbed non-native species often, and especially like invasive, have traits that enable them to thrive in disturbed environments. And so if a solar array is not well managed, it is just a disturbed environment. And so some of those traits could facilitate the non-natives really taking over and just thriving. And so one of the things that I think is really important and is how do we actually address it? Your question was specifically in terms of time. We had there's like a confounding variable where the first year we had massive flooding. And then the second year it was quite hot. And so there's hard to tell, like, is this like an annual variation? But what we can say is that there's a proportion and diversity of non-native plants, including two that are designated as invasive at the state level. Though the invasives were actually not a big proportion. So there was a ton of non-natives and a smaller subset of which were invasive. And I think a big part is how can we actually manage this? And the fact that we were finding that seeding was useful. And I think another part is, yeah, potentially how do we, are there other strategies that we can implement to better foster the diversity?
Thanks so much for diving into that a little bit more. I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. Going back to some of your earlier talking points, Linda had a question about lethal collection methods. Are you hopefully seeing less of a knee jerk propensity to use lethal collection methods? It reminds them of old time ornithologists shooting declining bird species.
Yes, I mean, I feel very strongly about this actually. So I think there needs to be much more intentionality. And I'm actually currently writing an opinion piece all about this. And it was actually in part sparked by, I mean, not unlike your example of the ornithology, like killing invasive, endangered birds. It was like I was at a conference, and a group of researchers were addressing agriculture, so like different types of farming practices in like a small region, and it was like 16 farms again in a small region over the course of 8 weeks with malaise traps. They collected 10 million insects. And I was infuriated. The person presenting didn't even was like proud. It's like, "Oh, well, so many we only could sub like we're only gonna be able to process a small subset." Like it was a good thing. Like it was just like, "We gotta catch them all." Something like that. And I was just so deeply upset that there was no guardrails preventing that. And so while I don't necessarily think it needs to be moving into the way of everything being hyper regulated. I do think there needs to be a shift where if there like there needs to be a plan, like if you're going to do lethal sampling, you need to have a plan for processing, cleaning, and entering so that those data are publicly available for anyone to use them so that it's not, in this case, the way that they were talking about it, it felt like we're all going to process this and then the rest of it's I don't know. And so I'm hopeful that we're moving in a direction where we move more and more towards intentional approaches for conservation. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. So, two questions here, somewhat similar. Can you speak more on what your seed processing looks like after wild harvesting? And then the second kind of follow up is, do you have any recommendations for a good source for native pollinator seeds for home gardeners?
Good question. So for that one, we were working with a team, that Arch Wild, that they work with nurseries, and so they actually did the collection for us. And so they have places where they wild source, and like they have permits for going and everything. Um, I think one of the best things to do is think about like what are the conditions in where you are in terms of like the soil. And so actually Xerxes, shout out to Xerxes. You will have like a really nice basically documentation of like think about what is the pH of like what is the amount of light that you have, because all of that will really matter. Speaking of Cass, who also worked at Xerxes, she's a dear friend, and whenever I was establishing this, we had really meaningful conversations where she was sharing that so many pollinator habitat efforts don't work, right? Like they are not successful. They don't establish. And if we don't actually think about the one, the soil conditions, two, the light availability, and three, the competition with like the species that are going to come in, it won't be successful. And so I think it's really important to know like how much time do you have, like what are the constraints, and then really adjust accordingly. And so all that is to say is depending on where you are, see if you can find a local nursery and ask them where they actually source and what their strategies are, because like they might actually be, using a really a source that's really far away, which again, if there's nothing local, like maybe it's still better if it's in a totally if it and okay, and I will say, it also depends on where you're working on. Like if you're in a place that's totally disturbed, having some diversity and like again, like it's if the alternative is just having purple loosestrife or some other invasive, I think it doesn't necessarily like that having further away species might still be useful. I think if you're talking about doing conservation in a much more pristine area or areas adjacent, then I think the intentionality of the genotypes is much more important. So since you're a home gardener, I would say the first thing to do is like look at, are there some local resources of local nurseries that are trying to do this meaningful work? Maybe reach out to Xerxes and see if they have any connections in your area, and maybe move on in that direction. Thank you for your question.
And thank you for your answer. Appreciate it. All right, bouncing around again. You covered so many topics, so we have questions ranging all over. Um, Someone else asked, is there a bias with the bioacoustics and image sampling to identify large-bodied species like Apis and Bombus that need to be taken into account with monitoring data?
Excellent question. And absolutely, yeah. So I think that all, as I mentioned, all of the approaches have biases. Given how much data it takes to accurately train these models, I focus on the two most dominant taxa in my system. And so I have intentionally focused on these types of bees, both like honeybees and bumblebees. I think that there are a lot of species of smaller and solitary bees that also make sounds and that are distinct. It would just be really important to make sure you have sufficient training data so that the model accuracy, those precision and recall curves are robust. I think that some of the much smaller bees, like I don't, yeah, I'm curious what sounds lazy blossom makes, but the fact that you can differentiate 20 species of mosquito gives me hope that with enough time and enough detail, we could maybe get, if not, certainly not this, we're never okay, I will say this, like, there's not a goal of, like, getting to Lasioglossum species, it's just not gonna happen. But I could imagine we could get maybe, like, there might be family level or generic level cues to where we could get a much finer resolution than we currently have.
Thank you. All right, we have another AI question, so we're gonna jump on that train. I am seeing a rise in the use of AI for conservation, but have concerns about the impacts of AI with water uses, massive data centers ruining habitats, data sovereignty. I'm curious if you have seen or thought through the ethics of using AI for conservation issues and what trade-offs we should consider before using or relying on it. Are there researchers talking about this that we could learn from?
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. And I think it's really important that whenever there is an opportunity, we don't just jump on without thinking critically. Just like everything else, there's trade-offs. I think while there are certainly concerns about data centers, that It also depends on the scale of what it's being used for. So, like, the amount of energy I was there was actually a recent, there's an Elevate program at UMass Amherst that focuses on renewable energy, and they very recently shared a study that was, like, trying to quantify, like, how much energy certain types of AI use versus others, and I think it's not just, like, all of it is wildly data intensive, or so we shouldn't use any of it, or we should just rely on it fully. So I think a little bit of it is like, what are the trade-offs and how much energy is going to be spent alternatively, and also where are you getting your energy from? And so I think I have been thinking about this a lot. And some of the ways that I've been thinking about it is like how much energy from where we're gathering our electricity, for example, how much of that is renewables? Like how much energy is for this type of model, it's you need to train it one time and then the model exists, and then it's just regular electricity usage versus it being continuous, heavily data AI usage. So I think that it's an excellent question and one that we should always think about to be intentional. And I appreciate the comment, and it's one that I'm thinking about, and one that I have an answer that's basically fluid, and that we are trying to address it as much as we can.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely things to consider. Building off of that a little bit, someone wanted to know if any of this AI or bioacoustic monitoring is available for community scientist use yet, for people like them who are doing their own amateur rewilding.
Yeah, totally. Well, my plan is for this to be again on the Raven Pro, which can be downloaded by anyone. They have both like a free version, and then there's one that because of the amount of like the expertise that it requires to host it, they have a paid version. And I'm still talking with them to figure out if we can get on if it's going to be on the free version or if it has to be on the paid premium version. But regardless, it's one that anyone could actually pay to use the service, versus having to have like a university credential or anything like that. Um, I think that one of the things that I'm seeing is that iNaturalist, the app that you can just get on your phone, they're now having also an audio version. And so there's more and more, they're moving more and more towards the direction of having these broader frameworks. And I think in the future it will be freely available, and openly to anyone. And how exciting that you're doing a rewilding project. I hope it goes beautifully.
Yeah, I love when people are telling us about what they're doing in their own community, in their own yard. It's so inspiring. So Ethan has a question, and I just want to thank Ethan for inspiring the next generation. They run a youth education program for pollinator conservation focused nonprofit in Oregon. Are there any key results from your research that kids need to know about? Basically, do you have any fun discoveries that you'd like kids to know?
Cool. Well, I think the vulture bees stuff is always everyone's like, "What?" So I think, maybe talking about how bees are these vegetarian wasps in the evolutionary tree, and that bees have to go like, they vary in what they eat. So even the ones that, like, eat pollen, some of them are specialists, and they'll only go to sunflower family, and there's some that will only go to the pea family, and there's some that will go to most things. And so within that, the fact that in the tropics, you have some that, will focus on meat, where I'm currently doing a review with 2 of my students, which is thinking about all the non-floral resources. And so yes, there's meat, and like there is a study that showed that these stingless bees could strip a frog to the bones in under 48 hours. They had stripped the frog to the bones. And so like thinking about like why? Because they're social, they're efficient at recruiting, and like they're very capable with their mouth parts. There's other ones that we had found where some of them specialize on tears, including there's a researcher who to study this, he like in Thailand, he just like literally he would go like this and try to not close his eyes. And there's picture, and we're gonna include this in the review where he's like his eyes covered with bees. And it's like really startling. And so some of them will use resin, some of them, you have sweat bees here in the US, depending on where you're calling from, that will just come to you. So there's a lot of other resources that bees use to take advantage of in these different landscapes. So I would say to the young people, tell them bees are so cool, insects are amazing, and they use many different resources beyond what we have historically thought.
Wow. I couldn't agree more. That's just I love all those anecdotes. Thank you. I hate to steer the subject away from vulture bees and all of that, but we do have so many other questions. Um, Back to the bioacoustics. Everyone's really interested in it. Is there any plan to use bioacoustics for interspecies interactions of bee species competing for flower resources, for example?
Yeah, good question. So I think that was partially like why I was really excited to do both honeybees and bumblebees, where in the US, and then in North America, you have the European honeybees as a non-native, that there are questions about like how much is it outcompeting the natives versus the bumblebee, which again is a dominant native, but it is a native group, and that's very important ecologically and in agricultural settings. So we're really interested in using that to get a sense of, is there a displacement in terms of time? Because that's one thing that you can get with bioacoustics that you can't get with a bull trap. It can tell you what time they're present versus were they present when you sample, at the end of the 3 days. And so I'm really interested in assessing if there's changes in terms of what time they come, the different groups, and how frequently we find one versus the other.
And we have another question about the bioacoustics. This is exciting from Annie, is a PhD researcher still using sweep nets and molecular methods to collect and identify pollinators in Kenya. They are
Cool.
thrilled to hear about your bioacoustics methods. It's quite fascinating. Thank you for the awesome comprehensive presentation. Can the bioacoustics data be used to optimize pesticide application timing and minimize harm to pollinators, as we are still continuing to advocate for the use of no pesticides?
Yes, totally. And I think that that's such a good question, Annie. Thank you. Of we have to work towards like in agroecological systems where we don't even need pesticides. That's the ideal, right? Where like you have enough predators and you have biocontrol agents. Yes, let's work towards that. But in the interim, IPM, like there's really great literature on IPM that if you're really intentional, you can cut down the amount of pesticides you use so much and have no impacts on yield of the target crop. Even if there's like a little bit damage, it's not enough to impact yield, with great benefits towards the pollinators in the surrounding area. So I think definitely having a better sense of activity period is really, really important. So I would say having a better sense of when that bees are active can help inform the spray times. And so I think that that's one thing to keep in mind. So thank you for your question and for your awesome work in Kenya. I can't wait to hear more.
Yes, echoing that thanks from here as well. All right, tying that in to back to our other conversations about plant and seed sourcing. Can you briefly speak to the subject of treated seeds and neonicotinoids and the importance of buying untreated seeds and pesticide-free plants grown from untreated seeds?
Totally. So I think that was some work that my PhD advisor, Scott McCart at Cornell, really has worked on. And I remember being in the lab and him sharing information from research that he was conducting or reading about, where it doesn't act like that is one of the elements where it's like not always in beneficial. Like you can have the the dust coatings that are spread in the air depending on if it's very windy conditions, and it doesn't always increase yield in the same way that's desirable. So I would say that that is one where ideally we would move away from that and have pesticides as a tool when it's necessary, while simultaneously promoting these other methods that are much more sustainable longer term. So I would definitely say that would be one where like I'm not saying like we should ban pesticides, all of them immediately, because again, that's not a we're currently embedded in a system. So I think to just say like black and white tomorrow, no, but I think that that would be one where we could much more quickly fade out while we simultaneously build up the biodiversity.
Um, all right, next question's from Karen. She's one of our ambassadors. Hi, Karen. Karen's recently seen some study results from the University of Oklahoma from grad students that look at the quantity of pollinators and larger numbers of taxa were found in man-made pollinator habitats versus prairie habitats. Do you find that to be true?
So I think it's really important for us to have a sense of time and like what natural means. So like for example, one of the things like I'm in Massachusetts, which I'm saying like, oh, it's currently 60% forested. And so if asked, then we'd be like, oh, that's of course a natural area. Whenever the European colonists arrived, there was 95% forest, which declined to less than 20%, and now has increased to 60%. And so there's a lot of things like that where it's like one might see a heavily forested area and think that that's how it's been for a long time, but actually that's relatively recent. And so similarly, when we're thinking about meadows, for prairies and like long grass prairies, the actual remnants of the old conditions, there's like it's less than 5% for a lot of these conditions. So I think depending on what has been the surrounding stressors, how fragmented it is, you're going to get very different conditions. And if you have an area that's like like the one that people have made, and they water them and they weed them, and like there's like a larger size and it's not fragmented, right? So like I wouldn't say it's like one is better or worse. I think it's more we just have to understand that there's a lot of factors at play that can influence what we're going to see.
Yeah, definitely things to consider. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for your questions. We have so many, but we do have to have time for just one more. So I'm going to end on this one, which I just love the curiosity here. Do bees sound different in a solar farm versus a pristine landscape?
Cool. So we actually very intentionally set out to do that, and like recorded more so than the bee sounding different, making sure we recorded the sounds of the generators and other things so that those wouldn't get confused. But we were finding that on the whole, they sound pretty different, and more that we're encapsulated that diversity in our model so that it can be robust for the sounds that the bees makes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today. That was really wonderful. I learned a lot, and thank you to our audience for the engaging questions. We do hope to have you back, but thank you so much again, and I hope
It's
you
my
all
pleasure.
have,
Thank you all so much for listening, and
yeah,
thank you so much for inviting me.
yeah, of course, anytime. Thank you to Cass for the recommendation. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.